Someone had a good question. I'm just going to paraphrase this. They were trying to make the connection. They heard a video of mine where where I was saying that a trauma is our triggers. They, that's our triggers. Trauma and repression, which is our core ego programming stored in the body. Think about it. Trauma and repression are self-protective imprints or programming. That's your, I gotta flee, I gotta fight, I gotta freeze here. Or I can't say that. I don't want to show sadness. I can't let her see that. Or holding back to stay safe or whatever. Not being vulnerable. Anytime there's a lack of vulnerability in relationship, there's trauma and repression. And if you were to do the reverse inquiry, pull up somebody close to you, we won't do it right now, but write this down. Because if you see resistance to this one, surefire indication of repression and trauma held in the body. So just feel into your body and pull somebody up, somebody close to you, and just say, I can be vulnerable with them, meaning I can feel and express my authentic emotions with them, can be vulnerable. Say it several times because repression hides. If you say it, you'll feel more like, no, I can't. Like, no, I can't just show her my anger or my sadness or something. Feel the response. It's held in the body. So if you don't see any thoughts, it doesn't mean anything. It just means it's unconscious. There is a mind-body connection. The most that you're going to get at first is just the body, though. So I can be vulnerable with them. Like, really imagine opening up to someone and just letting them see you. I can let them see me emotionally. I can let them see me. Do you feel the objection in the body? I can let them see me. I can open up to them. See that? I can be vulnerable. There's your trauma and your repression. I can fully be myself with them. Feel into the body. Remember that the mind can either tell a lie here, like, yeah, I could probably, it's a gatekeeper, right? It's trying to hide the repression from you, and the silence does it also. So if you get nothing in the mind and you just get energy, it's hiding it from you. And that's because the mind part of the mind-body connection is offline. That's all that means. So the energy that you feel has very powerful programming connected to it that's unconscious. Okay, now, with that setup, it's harder maybe to listen to the rest of the video thinking that you don't repress, or that maybe this message isn't relevant if you were thinking that. Because remember I've been saying that the conscious mind's a gatekeeper. It'll sit at these videos and say, this is interesting, but that's not my issue. My issue is like grief because of my mother, or that my husband pisses me off on a regular basis. That's my issue. It's not repression from childhood or trauma. What if the very thing that you're talking about is this? And it's just, you don't see it yet. Okay, it's so hard because it's unconscious, but I'm going to try to show it to you. I'm not going to be able to resolve it all with you because it's repression, it's a mechanism, but I'm going to bring it up to the surface here. If it comes up and there's a lot of energy and you don't know what to do with that, just rest and let everything be there, whatever's there, and tap if you need. So if something feels really, really sticky and a bit like too much, just start tapping and stay tapping until it kind of recedes. Remember that. That's your emergency measure, tapping. You may need that. I want to show it to you here. So I want you to pull up somebody who's triggered you recently. And I mean a real trigger. Like you were upset, you shut down, or something happened. And I want you to feel into your inner body as you rest here, just noticing, again, words, images, feeling, sensation, appearing to awareness. And just letting all that be for a moment before we start. because we're looking from this awareness. So it's important to notice that this is, we're looking from here. We are this awareness, and we're unconscious around something. So we want to recognize what we are here and just start noticing whatever's arising and letting it be, including sensation. Okay, so bring in that person where there's a recent trigger that it looks like it might not be connected to trauma or repression, or you don't know. So as you're feeling into your body, first do a boomerang to illuminate what identity is here. It's going to be probably like a deficiency story. You feel in the body and you say, what comes up for me here? Or who am I taking myself to be here in this relationship? Or what deficiency story arises for me? Pick one of those. Now, here, just listen, because if you can hear this, it's the beginning of getting to the repression. If you don't hear this, it's like you just remain unconscious to it. All of it can be. Can you hear an I thought, an identity here? Let's start just witnessing what comes up. Start with that. So, well, first what comes up is the identity. So let's say what comes up is I'm unlovable or something. Whatever it is, reverse it. Okay? So look back at the person and say, I am lovable. Or if it's good enough, I'm not good enough, say the opposite. I'm perfect as I am. And what that does is it conjures up the layers of that hidden identity that's hiding in the dark matter in your body. And now the mind part of the mind-body connection is online. That's important. See, you're witnessing thoughts that are normally very unconscious, but they're very connected to energy in the body. Can you see that? This is really important for the healing process, is to see that both mind and body appear to you as awareness, and then to welcome that, even if it's uncomfortable, because you have to remember, this is your resistance right here. Welcoming it is skillful. Welcome the thought, not just the energy. Don't just go down to energy, because when you do that, you lose sight of the things that you're believing. These thoughts go back into the unconscious, and then you buy back into the mind-body disconnect, as if the body's just producing something here by itself. It's not. So to bring the mind online, the reverse is I'm lovable, or I am good enough. And then the mind comes online for you to witness. Just let each arising be as it is, just welcoming it from awareness. Watch for the attempt to try to get through it all. It's more about just resting and allowing each one of these to be as they are, each thought, with energy on it. Now, this particular aspect of consciousness, ego, identity, it's actually, okay, here, I want you to hear me out, because this is not about me taking you through this inquiry right now. I don't think it would be a good spend of this time, because I want to show you something. Instead of always guiding people, I want to empower you with the insight of what is really going on here. And then that's so much more powerful than a process where I guide you. I'll guide you, come into the members area. I do it all the time for people. But here, let's talk about this. Do a little bit of tapping just to kind of let the deficiency story fall back into awareness for us for a moment, so you can just hear me and you're not hooked into that as much. Breathe a little bit, notice your breath, and then just rest as awareness and hear me for a second. We have to talk, because what we just did is we brought into awareness, out of the dark matter, the body, the identity of the trigger. Now, what you can do if you're really unconscious in non-duality is just investigate identity. Meaning, when I say really unconscious, I mean unconscious to what's driving it. What is underneath the surface driving that? So what I'm seeing is part of the non-dual, great non-dual bypass is that it's just unconsciousness and lack of skill. So we're not even seeing the repression mechanism, the trauma mechanism in that trigger. What you were seeing was identity. And identity is kind of low-hanging fruit, frankly, in my view, from where I sit now. Ego identity feels like low-hanging fruit. It's fairly accessible with this kind of inquiry. And it's just like a fish that jumps out of water, but then it has to go back in. Those thoughts that came up are coming out of the unconscious. Did you notice how much energy is on them? The reason there's so much energy on them is that in part is the emotion that you've held back through the years, concretized in the body. And so when you start to bring that deficiency story up, that deficiency story is a trauma response in part. I'll explain that in a second, but that explains why there's so much energy on it, because the stuff that you couldn't feel because of childhood is frozen in the body. It has programming with it that basically says, don't express this and don't feel it. So that's your primary repression, right? That's locked down. But out of the repression or from the repression comes a response to the trauma that you experienced, whatever made you shut down. When you shut down around a particular emotion, your system identified with a false version of self when you were a kid, right? As a response to what was happening. That's what I mean by trauma response. That's all that it means. Dad's angry. My response is that I have to shut down anger, whether I am aware of it or not. Then there's my primary repression, and it's locked in. So as I get to spiritual practices, the repression is there. The trauma programming is there, completely hidden, but it's producing these effects. So it produces, again, in the midst of a trigger, just like we looked at, it produces the identity of deficiency story, but even that hides, right? We had to conjure it up. You may have just felt like hurt in the trigger or angry. You may not have known what you were identifying with. The inquiry that we just did showed that to you, right? Okay, hear me out, because this is like where we totally fog out. This is the great non-dual bypass I'm explaining right now. If you start to go to sleep, it's normal. Just watch it back. What we're doing in non-duality, in my view, is still a very unconscious act, relatively speaking. We're dealing with the effects of trauma. And one of the low-hanging fruit, effects that are low-hanging fruit, is this deficiency story, because this is what you had to put forth with people when you were a kid. It's not as repressed as the emotion, in my view. So this is your imposter identity. This this is less unconscious because this is what you put forth to people. So when you're triggered in the trigger, what comes forth in the trigger to be triggered is this identity. It's not deeply unconscious. It is unconscious, but not like repression and trauma. And it is the effect of it, because when you were a kid, in a dispute or something happened with your parents, you had to shut down something that felt natural to express, false version of yourself. That's what I mean. That's low-hanging fruit. That's the imposter that you put forth to survive when you were a child. That imposter sometimes is the first thing to come out of the dark matter, is what I mean, because it's it's your face, it's your false face. It's your protective ego thing. Okay? So but the fact that you're seeing that, and if you investigate that, like a lot of people are doing in non-duality, the problem is it's connected to the repression. So if you're struggling with this who am I question, go to repression. Hear me out here. It is the great non-dual bypass, I'm telling you. And the more you sink it in, the deeper you will go with this. I almost promise you with it. Um, but you have to understand, in the midst of your trigger, what sometimes will show its face if you have KI. See, because if you're just resting as awareness, even the deficiency story might not come in to awareness, the mind part of it, right? You might feel the woundedness over the trigger, but you might kind of be shut down over what you are actually believing. So what KI does is it starts to show you first the low-hanging fruit, which means ego identity. And even though you might think of that as core, I don't think of that as core. Rupert Spira said that the separate self-identity is only a small percentage of our suffering, that our craving and our aversion is, the large majority, or I totally agree. Thank you, Rupert, because that's what I'm saying here, is that the ego identity is just a percentage of our suffering, but we're focusing so much on it because the repression and the trauma remains completely unconscious. If you can imagine that like dark matter here, and something comes out like identity, and we think, oh, this is core, because I don't see anything under it. But what is under it are the sensations in the body that are still dense or contracted or tight, or energy is held somewhere. That's it. Um, and the trauma and repression mechanism doesn't want to come out of that. So what can come out of it is like low hanging fruit, identity. Okay, now I know that that makes sense, right? If you couldn't feel and express you were a kid, then false version of self. So then false version of self gets triggered in your trigger with your spouse or whoever. Surely that makes sense. And then you also know not only does it make sense, but you just did an inquiry to show it to you. So we always use skill here to verify what we're saying, to make sure that it matches direct experience. So when I say that you got triggered on a deficiency story or identity, you now know that that's the case because we just conjured it up. You don't have to guess, like, is Scott correct about that? You verified it. Now, what you're going to want to verify is whether this trigger, and perhaps not all of them come from this, but a lot of them do. In order not to remain unconscious, you're going to want to go deeper with this. So I want you to pull up the person that was triggering you, and I want you to run through these inquiries and just see where the somatic response is. And I want you to write down which emotion you feel the most response around. And then we're going to get down to the deeper stuff here. So as you feel into the inner body and see this person, I want you to say, I can get angry at them. And then just feel your inner body. See if there's any objection, as if the body's saying, no. A slight response does not equal small repression. It could just equal it's unconscious for you. So if you say it several times, I can get angry at her. I can get angry at her. Now that response in your body, if you're feeling anything, that's your repression. So that is under the trigger. In other words, if you had been able to feel and express, and I don't mean necessarily put the anger on them, but somehow process that anger, like bring it into awareness in some way, even in a healthy way, would you really be defaulting to false version of yourself right now? Why? Why would you? Because if you could literally just say what you needed to say, you wouldn't feel deficient. You wouldn't feel like there's something wrong with you. You would have been able to express your authentic, whatever that is in that moment, and you wouldn't have defaulted in the same way to identity. See, so what I'm getting people to see is in the face of that, there's just unprocessed emotion. You're holding emotion back. And what scares people is they think, well, if I process this, then I'm going to get angry at them. That may happen, but we have tools now to help move the anger through. So you don't have to put it on them, but you don't want to stuff it down. That's not healthy. So there, did you see? That's what's behind it if it's anger. Now, for some, it's not. The primary repression is not anger. It could be fear, but let's go to hurt. So as you feel your inner body and you see that person, say, I wasn't hurt by them. I'm not hurt. And by the way, you can add on, I can go and express the hurt. I can tell them that I'm hurt, that they hurt me. Now, all you're noticing is there a somatic response. So, if there is, the idea is if you could just feel and fully transmute that hurt, if you could just allow it, you wouldn't go into default. If that's a primary repression, you wouldn't have to default to deficiency story in those triggers. You wouldn't be triggered as much, basically, or at all. If you really knew how to process your emotions, the stuckness of them. So if it's hurt, think about it. That's a repression. You have to hold it in for whatever reason. It didn't feel safe to feel it or express it at some point when you were a kid or whatever. And that's what you're doing now. And by not being able to feel and express your authentic emotions here, you're probably defaulting again to a deficiency story. Imposter, false version, can't be real. Can't be real with you. So I have to go back to this feeling about myself that I'm less than, that I'm lacking. And then people spend a lot of time in non duality with that. What I'm saying is that's connected to the repression. Come down into the body. Otherwise, you could spin in your wheels in non duality for a long time investigating self. I've actually worked with people who've been in organizations where the entire teaching or practice is devoted to seeing that there's no self in phenomena. And then they come to KI, massive repression. That's why they were identified with ego, this massive repression going on. They're having to do that work now. They didn't understand that it was connected to that. And so they, like I did, spent a lot of time looking at ego, which is an important part of this, is to look at who am I, but it's connected to the repression and trauma, and you're seeing it there in your triggers just now. The other thing is that trauma responses are active during our triggers. So what I just worked with you was on an emotional thing, like the trauma response of not being able to feel and express an emotion. We call that repression response or repression command. So there's programming that's commanding you to not feel and express what is authentic for you. There are also trauma commands, and they line up with the research that says trauma response, meaning fight, flight, freeze, fawn. For example, if you look at that trigger, what happened? What is your usual trauma response? Are you a fleer? Do you fight? Do you freeze? So I want you just to see that scenario of what happened and just say, if you're a fleer, I don't have to run. I don't have to run from this conflict or hide. I don't have to get away from this. You see that self-protective energy? If it's there, that's a trauma response. That's active during the trigger. So that's going on under the surface with the repression command. But on what you see is just like focusing on what they said or did. It's totally unconscious. But then as you do KI, you at least start to see that there's this identity here that's the imposter behind the trigger. But what I'm saying is the reason that that persists so much is because behind that is the holding back of what you are, what your natural expression is, whatever that is. Can you see it now that your triggers are connected to repression and trauma?